Well, hello everyone. It's great to be with you today. Welcome to the webinar for today, February 19th. For those of you not in the Midwest corridor, we have an impending snowstorm. So I know some folks are probably going to be tuning in a little bit late, and I'm sure there's weather in other parts of the country too. We can always count on some exciting weather this time of year. So thanks for tuning in. And for those of you who are joining us after February 19th, I trust that you'll also get some great information from today's webinar. I am super excited about this topic. We are going to be talking about connecting audiences to your why. My name is Kristen Hammett, and I am your host for today's webinar. As I mentioned last month, we are developing some themes around our webinars, blogs, and Facebook posts this year. First quarter, we're really focused on big picture topics. Last month, we learned about creating a culture of development. This month, we will be talking about telling your story and communicating your why. But before we begin, I have a few announcements that I want to share with all of you. First and foremost, our March webinar is only 2 weeks away due to spring break and kind of planning ahead for what we hope to be the inevitable sun. We are scooting our March webinar up. So mark your calendars now for March 6th. At 12 o'clock Central Time, we'll be talking about purposeful events. So look for that registration information following today's webinar. And then also wanted to share with you a change we're making with our webinar process. And that is that all of the valuable information our presenters have been so generous to share with us, whether that be an ebook or a PDF resource or another tool, those are going to be exclusively available in our Facebook group. So we'll be posting the ebook that Amy's going to be sharing with us. We'll post that on our Facebook group later this week. So please join our Signatory Ministry Services Facebook group, and you'll be a part of our community of development officers and ministry leaders there, where you can share ideas, get resources, including these exclusive webinar resources, and hopefully be encouraged. One more announcement is today we will be really focusing on Amy's presentation in the front of this webinar, and then we'll wait and bring all of our questions kind of after she's concluded her presentation. So hold your questions. You can either write them down or you can send them over that chat feature, that Q&A tab at the bottom of your toolbar. So feel free to continue to send those my direction, and I will help facilitate those at the close of Amy's presentation. All right, I think that covers our announcements. Again, I'm so glad that you have joined us for today's topic, connecting audiences to your why. I am so pleased to have Amy Wolf with us today. Amy is a senior trainer, executive coach, and event speaker for Distinction Communication in Portland, Oregon. In addition to coaching corporate lawyers and nonprofit advocates, shoe designers and engineers, and all that are in between those, Amy is also a TEDx speaker and coach for TEDx Portland. She loves mixing business and personal passions by facilitating trainings for community leaders in Rwanda. And Amy is also a family lady, and she enjoys spending time with her husband and daughters when outside in the outdoors. So without further ado, Amy, welcome to today's webinar. We're so excited to learn from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for trusting me with all of your time this afternoon. I am specifically going to be discussing storytelling, which is the how we connect audiences to our why, to the impact of our cause, why we do what we do. I don't think I've seen storytelling have such a significant impact than when I was in Rwanda in 2016. I was sitting in a pineapple crop in a small village called Mabuga, and I was sitting with 100 survivors from the 1994 Rwandan genocide. They had meetings regularly with each other, and during these meetings, which I got to be a part of the way they spend their time is taking turns sharing their stories, specifically their stories of survival. It's hard to imagine since 94 that there may be some who have never shared their stories before out loud, but it is still true that there are some who have not. So in these meetings with each other, they take turns sharing their testimonies. My good friend Ben Kayumba is a survivor himself, and he has set up 32 of these different community groups around Rwanda. And I asked Ben, why do they go through the pain of speaking out loud what happened to them? Why are stories so important? And he said, well, there are 3 reasons. First is that when we share our own personal stories, it is acknowledgement of what has happened to us, and it is part of our healing going forward, where we find freedom in healing. Second, when we do this in groups, we feel a part of each other's healing. And third, when friends like you come to visit and hear, it moves you and changes you, and our stories become intertwined. That is the power of stories, that they weave our humanity together, where we can feel so deeply connected to each other, even at times when we're not physically present with each other. So today I want to walk you through 3 keys to storytelling, specifically when you're telling your story in front of a person, a couple people over coffee, or even perhaps to thousands of people from a stage at one of your large events. They're going to be really practical, but we got to keep this moving. So I am going to move through these tips fairly quickly, knowing that there will be time for Q&A at the end, and that I will pass on these materials to you so you can review them later. No, you guys don't have to panic and take as many notes as you possibly can. The first tip I want to provide to you this afternoon is that stories need to have the right level of detail. Have you ever heard a speaker share a story that, while at first was interesting, it went on and on and on? I had a client last week tell me that she sat through a presentation where she leaned over to her colleague and said, "Someone needs to tell the speaker it's not open mic night." Ouch, ouch. The one way, practical way that you can find out if your stories have the right level of detail is by timing them out. Anytime that I am sharing stories in my talks or presentations or workshops, I record myself telling the story just simply through a timing app, a recording app on my smartphone. I'll look down and think that's a 5-minute version of that story or experience, and find that it was 12 minutes long. So then I rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat until I found the right level of detail. One of the ways that I want to encourage you to find the level of detail, imagine storytelling is like painting a picture, where you need to have enough vivid detail that people are drawn into the painting. But if there's too much detail, we don't know where to look first, and there's so much to see and so much to hear that we might even lose the whole point or the whole focus. But too little of detail, things aren't super vivid, I might lose my interest fairly quickly. So paint the right level of detail in your storytelling. Here are some things to avoid when you're finding this right level of detail. Whenever I'm working with a TED Talk speaker or a keynote speaker working on a story, most often, more times than not, I hear them use ramp up statements. For example, I want to tell you a story that, man, it was just burned into my memory of when I learned a really difficult life lesson. That's a ramp up statement before you actually tell your story. With all my speakers, I always encourage them, and I encourage you, ditch the ramp ups. Even when you start a keynote or start a talk or a conversation, jump right into the story. For example, in 3rd grade, I experienced something that I will never forget that made me realize my ability to overcome a difficult circumstance. So here you have enough detail, you know where the story's going, you know what it's going to be about, but I'm not going on and on ramping up. Immediately you have some detail to the scene, setting the stage. Second, when you're telling stories, don't make assumptions about what you think people know. Maybe you reference a place, but people don't know where that is. You reference a person, but they don't know that person is part of your staff or your team. It's really easy for us when we're telling our own stories to start to make assumptions of what people might already know. It is best practice as communicators to zoom out and consider our content as if we were hearing it for the first time. And third, don't wing it. Even though I have people say, Amy, I wing messages and talks and I feel really comfortable, I will tell you this. Just because you feel comfortable winging it doesn't mean that it comes off well. Don't wing it. In fact, go back to that first tip, which is time out your stories, figure out the right level of detail, and practice it a few times. I want to give you an example of a story in just a few minute video clip here. His name is Boyd Vardy. He is from South Africa. And I want you to listen to a portion of his TED Talk where he tells a story. It alludes to tip number 2. So listen carefully at the end why the story mattered.
On the day that Solly saved my life, he was already my hero. It was a hot day, and we found ourselves down by the river. Because of the heat, I took my shoes off, and I rolled up my pants, and I walked into the water. Solly remained on the bank. The water was clear, running over sand, and we turned and we began to make our way upstream. And a few meters ahead of us, there was a place where a tree had fallen out of the bank, and its branches were touching the water, and it was shadowy. And if it had been a horror movie, people in the audience would have started saying, "Don't go in there, don't go in there." And of course, the crocodile was in the shadows. Now, the first thing that you notice when a crocodile hits you is the ferocity of the bite. Wham! It hits me by my right leg. It pulls me. It turns. I throw my hand up. I'm able to grab a branch. It's shaking me violently. It's a very strange sensation having another creature try and eat you. And there are few things that promote vegetarianism like that. Solly on the bank sees that I'm in trouble. He turns. He begins to make his way to me. The croc again continues to shake me. It goes to bite me a second time. I notice a slick of blood in the water around me that gets washed downstream. As it bites the second time, I kick. My foot goes down its throat. It spits me out. I pull myself up into the branches, and as I come out of the water, I look over my shoulder. My leg from the knee down is mangled beyond description. The bone is cracked. The meat is torn up. I make an instant decision that I'll never look at that again. As I come out the water, Solly arrives at a deep section, a channel between us. He knows, he sees the state of my leg. He knows that between him and I, there is a crocodile. And I can tell you this man doesn't slow down for 1 second. He comes straight into the channel. He wades into above his waist. He gets to me, he grabs me. I'm still in a vulnerable position. He picks me up and puts me on his shoulders. The other thing about Solly, he's freakishly strong. He turns, he walks me up the bank. He lays me down, he pulls his shirt off. He wraps it around my leg. Picks me up a second time, walks me to a vehicle, and he's able to get me to medical attention. And I survived. Now I don't know how many people you know that go into a deep channel of water that they know has a crocodile in it to come and help you. But for Solly, it was as natural as breathing. And he is one amazing example of what I have experienced all over Africa. In a more collective society, we realize from the inside that our own well-being is deeply tied to the well-being of others. Danger is shared, pain is shared, joy is shared, achievement is shared, houses are shared, food is shared. Ubuntu asks us to open our hearts and to share. And what Solly taught me that day is the essence of this value is animated, empathetic action in every moment.
I'm not sure if you reacted to the story the same way I did the first time I heard it, but my jaw was hung open, couldn't believe it. I was there at the river with him. It was the right level of detail for me to see what was happening, envision it, feel the feelings that he was feeling. In the scale of the talk, this was just a few minutes, which felt like an appropriate scale of story to fit into a 10-15 minute talk. The other best practice that Boyd showed so well here is our second tip, which is that stories need to have a clear purpose that serves your audience. He didn't just want to share surviving a crocodile attack, although that would have been entertaining. It wouldn't have had any value, except that he made the story matter. He did that at the end. Did you catch it? He talked about the idea of Ubuntu. I am because you are. The idea that we are so intertwined into each other's stories. When you're sharing a story or someone else's story or an analogy or even a timeline of events within your cause, there should be a clear purpose. For example, if I shared a personal story of discovering a need within my community, maybe I can assume that people understand why I'm sharing that specific night on what I experienced or saw, but there needs to be a transitional statement that takes me from this singular individual personal experience I had and zooms out to be a universal truth for everyone. And that's what Boyd's talk did. He went through a very interesting experience, personal experience, but then zoomed out to a universal truth. We call these transitional statements. They're one-liners. I craft them with clients to make sure that all the buckets of their content, their stories, and their main ideas and information and data, that each section feels connected and threaded together. So use these transitional statements as in between sections. They should be short and concise, but also use them to surface out from a story to a universal truth. For example, when I am doing training for small groups, I tell the story, my story, of whitewater rafting down the Nile River in Uganda when I was in college. This picture is a still taken from a video. This is a class 5 rapid that the locals in Uganda named the bad place. This was not good news for us. I really had no idea what I was getting myself into that day. But when we realized we were going to get tossed in these rapids, there were 3 major reactions from our group. A few people were absolutely paralyzed with fear. They weren't sure how they were going to make it through these rapids that day. They had really no idea how big they were. The second reaction was a majority of people in our group who thought, what have I got myself into? But I'm all in. I'm going to embrace this. And the third reaction was a real minority in our group, people who you can imagine were floored, totally floored. So this was on their bucket list. They were so excited to raft these rapids that day. I use this story in my workshops because this is how I pivot out of this experience. When I help people through public speaking, I normally hear one of those 3 reactions. Amy, I am paralyzed with fear when I speak in front of others. Or, all right, you're all in. You don't really know what you get yourself into. You're not super comfortable, but you're willing, especially willing to be here in training. And then there's a small group of people that actually really enjoy public speaking. Well, regardless of what your heart rate does in our speaking practices today, I want permission to be your guide, to help navigate you through trying some new skills. That's how I use my personal story of rafting the Nile to help my audience, my attendees, my participants understand that we have different reactions, different comfort zones when it comes to presenting and speaking, but that I am here for them as their guide. The third key to storytelling, we're going to unpack it a little bit in greater detail than the others. And that is, don't retell an experience or a story, relive it. If we think back to Boyd Vardy's TED Talk, he wasn't just retelling an experience that he had, he relived it. And that's why we felt like we were there. That's why we felt the anxiety that he felt, the fear that he felt, is because he relived the experience. This brings us to the 4 foundational skills to every really great communicator. I'm going to fly through these, but remember, we will provide materials to you after the webinar today. The first foundational skill to every great speaker is eye contact. We all know to make better eye contact, but what does that mean? Most people don't know what good eye contact is. So first, start by asking yourself, how long do I connect with individuals in my audience, in the room, across the table from you? Most people, when they speak, are scanners. They scan, or they have thinking spots, meaning when they're trying to figure out what they want to say next, almost always at metrics or time frames or transitions, their eyes will look to the ceiling, dart to the floor, or float above people's heads. Those are thinking spots. None of that is good eye contact. So good eye contact is when we're having 3 to 4 second conversations with people in front of us. When we do that, they feel a part of our content. They feel like it's a conversation, not me talking at you or over you. Less than 3 to 4 seconds and speakers look disconnected or nervous. More than that, yes, is creepy. And I know all of you are really worried and concerned about creeping your audiences out by staring them down. Because if you were in a coaching session with me, you would realize 3 to 4 seconds is a long time to look at someone. But when we're really, truly, genuinely connecting with people, even let's say one-on-one, we will hold out eye contact longer than half a second or float slightly above their heads with our eye contact. This is harder in practice. It's a great tip to hear, but it's difficult to practice. So I encourage you, start to practice your talks out loud, talking to maybe a fake audience, a colleague or a friend, for 3 to 4 seconds at a time. The second foundational skill that helps us look like we're reliving a story, not just retelling, is our hands. What do we do with our hands when we're talking? It's the number one question I get asked as a speaker coach. The question I want you to ask yourself is, do they get stuck? Is there a repetitive behavior? I see a lot of hand washing, ring spinning, folded into pockets, clenched together in front of the sternum, which 90% of speakers close their posture off with their hands or their arms crossed over the center of their chest. It's instincts. When we feel under threat, we tend to close off our posture and protect our vital organs. So what do we do when we notice these things? 2 ways I would coach you. One is to use your hands instead for meaningful gestures that illustrate your ideas. And then second, when you're done using them as gestures, put them in a relaxed posture, which is not clenched in front of our core, but let your arms and hands rest and relax at your sides. It might feel mechanical at first, but it makes speakers look much more calm and composed. And then those gestures are more impactful. Real quick, 3 tips to good gestures. Number 1, make them bigger. Larger gestures have more impact. It makes you look more believable. And when you are speaking to a large room, it is important that you don't shrink on stage, but take up and own the space. Second, gestures linger. They are not quick or frantic. There are some people that have so much passion, but they look like they're flailing with their gestures. Let it slow them down and let them linger. And finally, my third tip is build out a library of gestures mentally. Tell a story, practice using your gestures, and then the idea is that you've almost prepared them in advance. You've created this mental library to access under pressure in go time when you're truly speaking in front of others. Here's a TED Talk speaker I supported a couple years ago. Dr. Albert Chi is on the right, and his patient, Johnny Matheny, is on the left. His TED Talk was about this prosthetic limb, which is controlled intuitively by Johnny's mind. It was an insane talk. We found that Dr. Chi had a hard time memorizing his content. But when we practiced with gestures over and over again, it's almost like his body's muscle memory with the gestures prompted the content for him. Studies suggest that gestures can help the speaker retain their content, remember it, if they practice with gestures during their talk. And this was a prime example of that. Just in case you're wondering, it's really painful to be gripped by a prosthetic limb that can crush metal. I'm just kidding. He didn't really crush me, but we had a lot of fun with it. The third tip quickly is movement, how you use a stage. This is obviously not applicable if you're seated, but if you are standing, ask yourself, is there any movement in my delivery? Is it purposeful? Or is it swaying and rocking, shifting and pacing? Those aren't purposeful. So quickly, a way to use your space well is to use the puller and plant method. The planting is just staying steady, not moving on your feet, but nice and steady. The puller concept is when you want to move in your space, find a 3 to 4 second conversation in your room and use the connection with that audience member to pull you to their side of the space. This is how we make sure when we're using the space around us and moving on stage or in front of the room that it looks natural and purposeful and we maintain that great eye contact. All right, last skill is voice. Are you missing punctuation? Do you stop at your sentences? Hang at your commas? Or do you have a lot to say in a short amount of time and you get that heart rate? And we hate silence, right? So we talk as fast as we can. Normally we try to say too much, so there's that. And it's hard as an audience to listen to that. Listen for pausing. Pauses are the anti-filler word. If you say and so, you know, right? Instead, practice with pauses. Make sure you're listening to your pace, that it's delivered well, and that there's vocal variety. I can hear the emotion. I can hear the passion in your voice. Think of chunking your ideas together and forcing the punctuation. Maybe it's a couple sentences, maybe it's just a sentence, but you're going to pause and land on that period longer than you probably think necessary. I know that was a crash course in public speaking skills, but I want to review. To be a good storyteller, the stories need to have the right level of detail. They need to have a really clear purpose, a universal truth for your audience, and relive your stories. Don't just retell them. And it might be someone else's story. It might be the story of an organization or the birth of a ministry, but make sure that they can hear and they can see your passion.
Awesome. That's great information, Amy. I know that I have a couple of questions just in how this would relate specifically to those nonprofit leaders. I think they're all very accustomed to the power of telling a story, a client's story of, overcoming the obstacles. The organization comes in and assists in some way, and the client is able to overcome their circumstances. So I think that is really good. I think our audience for the most part is really used to that process of at least understanding. I think what was really important that I heard from you is this whole right level of detail. I don't know for all of you listening, but I have a 10-year-old son who, he gets in my car, and I appreciate this so much. So I really try to watch what I say, but he has a very difficult time determining which details are important to the story and which are not.
Yeah.
So can you help, I think one of the key pieces that you said was just this whole idea of practicing it and timing it out. Any additional information you can share relative to how do I engage folks so they feel like they're a part of it but balance out ensuring I haven't told too much and I lose them in the process.
Yeah, anytime I'm working out the specific details, I'm always asking myself, does this help them understand more clearly the takeaway or the impact? I will time it out. I know I have to scale it down a few minutes. What levels aren't, or what details are not critical to getting what I want you to get? And it's a simple question to ask, but if we were being honest and willing to edit, which some people just hold their content so close, but if we hold it loosely and really focus on serving the audience, not what we want to say, then I think we keep coming back to the question of, does this make it more clear and impactful? Or does that detail not necessarily matter, even though it was very important to me or special to me or personal to me for whatever reason? And the second tip I would share is practice it with someone that's not immediately involved in your work. They will be able to tell you, okay, that was interesting. You kind of lost me at that part. It's difficult to find honest truth tellers, but hopefully you can find one or two in your life and say, hey, can I practice a 3-4 minute story with you? And maybe they'll help you identify the parts that didn't resonate as much.
Yeah, I think those are great tips. I actually had written down what you just shared about practicing with someone who is not familiar with your work. If you have a teenager, they will be brutally honest with you. So you may not want to go to a teenager, but certainly someone who, even a friend, if you're on a walk with someone or having coffee with a friend that's not related to your work, I think they can, certainly you can even just tell from their nonverbal cues whether or not they are tracking with you or not. So I think that's a really great hint, to not practice with your CEO or your development staff who are very familiar with the subject matter that you're sharing. So I think that's really good. I also am struck by how often when you said the rinse and repeat, no matter where we are in our speaking careers, it really is critical to practice and practice and practice. Would you agree?
Yes, I do this for a living. I speak maybe as often as I'm speaker coaching, which is really my day gig. And I think people think that storytelling or being a good speaker is just innate ability. You're born with it or you aren't. It's something you have or you don't. And maybe within your organizations, you've deemed that one person the storyteller. That's not fair. I don't think it's a ability you're born with. I think it's a skill that absolutely anyone can develop. I think for some people it's more uncomfortable and they really have to roll up their sleeves and embrace the role in front of others. But these skills that I unpacked with you are the same skills I use with CEOs at Intel and Nike and the TED Talk speakers and the nonprofit directors I support here in my community. These are it. If we commit to them and have accurate self-awareness and can carve out time to prepare, rinse and repeat, I think the sky is the limit for the impact that you can have as a communicator of these important stories.
That's great. Any closing thoughts you have for us?
Yeah, I just want to encourage you. In 2016, when I was in Mabuga, at the end of day, after hearing the stories from these survivors, my friend Ben turned to me and said, "Will you share your story?" I panicked. I don't know if this is an all genders thing, but I know for women in particular, we compare our children's behavior and we compare our houses and compare all these things. And for me that day, I found myself comparing my grief. My story is not their story, Ben. Like my story is nothing, my suffering is nothing in comparison to your suffering. But Ben knew my story of witnessing the death of my brother when I was 14. And he knew about my journey of my faith of believing that God was sovereign and that my pain actually brought me some very clarifying purpose in my life to empathize with others and help others who have lost a sibling. So I told my story with nerves and a translator, unsure of how I would be received. And the most beautiful thing happened. Rwanda is a fairly non-emotive culture as far as listeners go, which as a speaker is really tough. But they started to weep for me in my story, just like I had wept for them. So I encourage you, if there's ever opportunity to exchange stories, have people create the opportunity for people to exchange them, where it's not just a one-way share of stories, but that people feel heard also, that there is room for anyone to show up with any kind of story and that we don't compare. And if there's a way that you can facilitate an exchange of story, I would say take it if you can.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate your very practical tips and your experiences and just your expertise. This was a very generous offering of your time and your skill, and we are so thankful for that. To my audience, to those that are listening, I do want to share a few things to you. I'm reminded just in Amy sharing that story, how we do sometimes focus on our clients' stories, and you have a story too. There is a reason you're doing the work that you're doing. There is a reason that you are investing yourself in the lives of others to make this world a better place in whatever capacity that is. So share your connection. Don't just share a client's story, share your story. Be encouraged that that may be what resonates with someone and makes an ultimate difference. So don't shy away from that, similar to how Amy just shared her really testimony of what was a very difficult experience, but was able to become a platform to minister to others. Coming away from today, I encourage you to really evaluate what your key learning was. Some of you may not speak very often in front of people. So maybe the question is, how do I relate this on a one-on-one meeting? How do I take some of these skills and apply them in a smaller setting? Some of you, it's fundraising season. You may have galas or banquets ahead of you, and there's going to be an opportunity for a presentation. How can you change what you've done in the past and improve it with some of these skills that you've learned today? I don't know what your takeaway is, but I encourage you to take a few minutes and consider how you might improve the way you tell a story and connect with your audience. As always, if the Signatory can be of help to you, please don't hesitate to contact me. The Signatory wants to help equip you in your development efforts and partner with you in your major donor gifts to see radical generosity impact your ministry and the kingdom. Mark your calendars for March 6th to learn how to plan an effective, purposeful event when we have Tracy Nice, who is an experienced event planner and specializes in strategic planning for efficiency and effectiveness. Join us for our March webinar. Be sure to check out our Facebook page for that ebook and additional resources that Amy is sharing with us. And I hope to connect with you soon and join you on March 6th for our next webinar. Thank you for all the work that you do. God bless.